So André Marquand is working at the Donders in Nijmegen at Radboud University. And as many of you know, we are very interested in his work for the last years because mental disorders are highly heterogeneous. And André has pioneered the field of using neuroimaging and some models he will describe to decipher this variability. And I think he's a very recent recipient of the ERC Consolidator grant for this work, so congratulations. And André will speak about using machine learning and big data to study variability in mental disorders. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. It's very nice to be here, even though I'm still sitting in my kitchen. But I'll just share my screen. And then we'll start. Okay, perfect. So I hope you can hope you can see my screen. Please interrupt me if you have any questions. So I'm going to talk about some work that we've done in the last years for charting heterogeneity in psychiatric disorders. I'd like to start just with a sort of a bit of context. So I'm a methodologist. I develop analysis methods based on machine learning, and this is really kind of the vision of our research group. We aim to develop innovative machine learning methodology, apply it to big data problems, and try to have impact on real clinical problems. I'll talk to you about three things today. So I'm going to talk to you about some, I would say, more classical approaches for stratifying clinical cohorts. I'll talk about some work that we've done that aims to use big data cohorts to make predictions at the level of the individual participant, the individual patient. And then I'll also talk about some methodological developments that underpin some of these clinical findings. I'll try to keep it pretty high level, but hopefully there's some time at the end for some questions. Okay, so the starting point for the talk today is let's think of what I would say the largest proportion of clinical research, biomedical research uses, which is a so-called case control comparison that effectively assumes that we try to find group differences between patients and controls, for example, or people that might respond to a particular treatment or those that do not. And the underlying assumption is that these groups are very clearly defined entities, and effectively we're looking for differences in group averages. And I would like to just emphasize that this is not this is a very, very broad paradigm, and I'd also like to make it even more general in the sense that this is the kind of comparison that we're doing when, for example, we do statistical parametric mapping. We want to find differences between groups at every box on the brain, for example. It's the same kind of group comparison that we might use for a genome-wide association study, or for using classifiers to separate clinical groups. So the point is that we are assuming that these entities that we are performing a statistical test to discriminate or using a classifier are well-defined entities. Now, it's probably not the case certainly in most psychiatric disorders, but I would argue in many areas of medicine that is an oversimplification. And the classical approach that is used to try to shift away from this case control type thinking would be something like this, which is accepting that the patient group, for example, might not be heterogeneous, and we might look for some kind of subtypes, if you like, of the clinical group. And this approach is very widely. This kind of thinking is very widespread. I'm showing you here a picture from a review in Science a few years ago by Thomas Insel, and this is really at the core of the so-called research domain criteria initiative, which drove the research research line in their NIMH for a number of years. And the basic idea is that we have these classical symptom-based classifications, so depression, schizophrenia, autism, for example. These are diagnostic labels that are based on symptoms. If we were to aggregate these heterogeneous conditions, acquire some data, for example, neuroimaging, genetics, symptom scores, and so on, the idea is that we then can derive a restratification of individuals that might map onto the outcomes or the underlying biology more accurately. This sounds like a really nice idea, and it's a very prevalent approach. It's actually, there's nothing new about it. So there is a huge number of publications now, a really long history of studies in psychiatry that aim to solve this particular problem. And effectively, any disorder that you might like to consider has this kind of approach has been applied to. And even hundreds of millions of dollars that are invested into the RDoC initiative hasn't really shifted that. So we still haven't moved away from the classical diagnostic labels for most conditions. And I would like to argue in this talk that one reason for that is because this step where we move from biological data to clusters reclassifications of disorders is not specified. So it's not clear how we can make that transition. And I'd like to illustrate this discussion with one very high profile paper that was published a couple of years ago. I'll give one example to show why this is perhaps a little bit problematic. This is arguably one of the most influential publications in psychiatry in recent years. It was published in Nature Medicine. And the idea was that these authors used resting state fMRI and canonical correlation analysis. I won't go into details about the methodology, but the idea is that they estimate mappings between biology as measured by resting state fMRI and symptoms. And those are the basis for this kind of stratification using a clustering algorithm. And on the face of it, these so-called biotypes, 4 clusters that you can see down on the bottom here, quite appealing. They predicted treatment response using TMS, and they were transdiagnostic, and they applied some levels of validation to these clusters. Now, this one of my then PhD students, now postdocs, Richard Dinger, sort of became a little bit suspicious of these findings and aimed to do a replication. So the replication was at the level of the methodology. So he took the methodological pipeline that the authors had used and then applied it to an independent cohort. And the starting point is a very low-tech observation. So these are the biotypes, these clusters that were central to this publication. And you might notice that some of these are the ambiguous points have been grayed out. And so if we were to just do something really low tech, like color all the dots the same color, you can see that the evidence for distinct clusters is quite it's not that strong. So Richard took it a bit further. So I won't go into the details of the methodology, but basically he took the NESDA sample, which is a large Dutch sample of depression and anxiety, and performed more rigorous statistical procedures, so using proper outer sample validation, that is testing on independent data to get really reliable estimates of generalizability, and replicated this pipeline. Now, what he showed, I think, quite convincingly, is that we can get very strong associations between biology and behavior, just as you saw in the previous slide. But there's nothing particularly surprising about that. And in other words, the model is very severely overfit. So here in the right-hand side, I'm showing you under a null distribution, which just under permutation, it's nearly always the case that you get really strong correlations like this. And then when we apply clustering, we can get them and we can derive a set of clusters, but they're not stable, and there isn't evidence for distinctness amongst the clusters. So so that casts a little bit of doubt, I think, on the, and this kind of sort of multifaceted problems with validation, different levels of validation, is really common in the literature. So it's something that, and I think it's one of the reasons why, we haven't really moved much down the road using this classical subtyping biotyping. So for the rest of the talk, I'd like to abstract away from these sort of, I would say, simple cases, either a case control approach or clustering approaches, to, I would say, more realistic scenarios where we might have something more akin to a spectrum of functioning, or we might be trying to understand variation where we have a whole collection of different mechanisms, a whole collection of different comorbidity and so on and so forth. So let's move from this idealized scenario to what we might see in the real world. Now, one of the techniques that we've developed, invested quite some time in over the last years, is normative modeling, and I'll describe that at a very high level. So basically, everyone, I'm assuming, will be familiar with these kind of pediatric growth charts that aim to chart population variation in terms of biological parameters, like, for example, weight, as a function of age. So what we do in normative modeling is we take a very simple idea. We take these pediatric growth charts and we substitute the variables for things that are relevant in psychiatry, for example, learning and mapping between some clinically relevant variables and biology. And we can use this approach to derive a kind of a growth chart for the brain, if you like, where we might use some variables that we think are important. For each sampled brain region, we get an independent or a dependent prediction as to how this might develop over age, for example, how each brain region might develop over age. The idea is that when we apply this kind of approach to a really large population cohort, we can get an estimate of what it means, what it looks like to be healthy, or what does population variation look like across this particular cohort, such that we can then make a prediction as to whether, at the level of each individual subject, a statistical prediction. So that means that we get subject level statistics as to how each individual differs from the expected pattern. We can do that across cohorts of individuals, and we might say, well, these all differ from the expected pattern in a particular way. We can use this as basis for subsequent clustering as well, and I'll illustrate some examples to highlight this idea. But the point is that we've moved from making statements about groups to statements about individuals. And of course, this is not a new idea. Just to sort of have a brief historical digression, these kind of growth charts have been around for a long time. We're using fancy statistical methods to estimate them in an automated fashion, but the idea is very old. This is the first the first one that I'm aware of, anyway. It's from Sir Francis Galton, aiming to chart the age of the height of different British school children. You look through they've been used in many different ways, and they're capable of some quite subtle distinctions. So this is again a more recent growth chart showing the height of British school children, and you can see that there's an increase with regard at the time of puberty, which becomes more evident if we plot, for example, velocity, centels of variation in velocity rather than height itself. And we can then subsequently align these. Of course, people grow at different rates. They might have different, there's individual variability. So we can look for the peak in growth velocity and then align them post-op. So they're very flexible tools. That's, kind of what I would like to convey with this slide. What we're looking to do with these kind of techniques is we can do a number of different things. So if we have longitudinal data, we have cross-sectional data, we can say, well, is someone an extreme in one way or another, either a high centile or a low centile? With longitudinal data, these become very sensitive tools indeed. So we can determine whether this individual, for example, at time point 1 and time point 2 is following the expected trajectory, or whether there's a centile crossing, which might give us some kind of cause for concern. So the way that that's done in practice in the low-tech world, if you like, would be to use something like Thrive lines, which, I mean, the details are not important, but you could say that this would be some kind of plastic overlay that you put on top of the growth chart, and you could say, well, this is the a statistical measure of, say, the lower 95th centile that we could use to determine whether a subject is growing more slowly than we would expect on the basis of the population. And I'll come back to this idea a bit later on. So we've applied these normative modeling techniques in many different disorders. It's largely been the work of Thomas Wolfers and Mariam Sabihi. And I'd just like to give you a very high-level overview of some of the applications of this normative modeling technique. So we've applied them in psychiatry, in schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, ADHD, and autism. And I'm showing you on the left-hand side the classical group differences. So, for example, what you would get from doing a t-test. This is the case control analysis, and you can see in schizophrenia we have robust group differences, bipolar, some group differences, ADHD, it's becoming a bit more indistinct, and in autism we have very few at all, very few differences at all. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you the overlap of different individual level deviations. So this is looking at the statistics at the individual level, and then overlaying them across the cohort to see where different individuals have common effects. And the interesting thing to me is that you can see that regardless of the presence or absence of robust case control effects, in all these different disorders, we have, number one, many individual level deviations that in the case of schizophrenia somewhat recapitulate the group level differences, but there's in fact very low overlap. What I'm showing here in the top three panels is the proportion of subjects that have a deviation in the same region, and threshold at 2%, which means that the regions that you see have more than 2% of the subjects in the cohort have an atypicality in that region. So you can see that there's a lot of variation underlying these disorders that it's not reflected in the average, and that's really a key point. And in the case of autism, we can see that despite not having any group differences at all, virtually every vertex in the brain, this is cortical thickness data, shows an atypicality in some subjects. So the message is that it's there are very widespread deviations, but they're very individualized. So we don't have the same atypicalities in the same subjects. You might think, well, that always happens. It's a truism. It isn't. So this is what happens in dementia. So, for example, in dementia, we have deviations in up to 25% of the same subjects in the medial temporal lobe. So there's much more consistency in terms of the effects that we might expect to see. So in dementia, you could say, well, the average is a good representation of the average patient, if you like. It gives us more individual information about an individual. But in psychiatric disorders, that's clearly not the case. So Thomas subsequently is very interested in replication. So he took his finding in schizophrenia. So in this figure, I'm showing you on the left-hand side the actual normative model. So as what happens on average as people age. These are the individual deviations I've shown you before for bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. In two independent cohorts, he did exactly the same analysis, didn't change anything, and got what I think are quite remarkable replication. So it really gives us some confidence that these individual level deviations are really robust. Of course, that's not the end, because what I've shown you is a way to kind of open the lid, if you like, on what's happening underneath group level differences. That's really not enough, because we want to not just see all the heterogeneity and marvel at it. We'd like to understand it a little bit. So what we can do is we can take these individual level statistic images, which show in a statistical sense how each individual differs from the expected pattern. And we might want to get some kind of risk score. So we can say, well, on average, how much should we be concerned about this particular individual? How many deviations they have, for example? And you could say for this individual on the left, for example, they have a high load, and on the one on the right, that you might be less concerned. And you can use these in the same way that you might use polygenic risk scores in genetics. And we use an extreme value statistics approach. I'm not going to go into details. Something else we could do is we could say, well, let's take some kind of factorization, matrix factorization technique to derive a set of components that say, okay, we have a set of risk profiles, and each individual expresses these risk profiles to a greater or lesser degree. So in this example, I'm showing you two different risk profiles. They're associated with a set of brain regions that are associated with each of them. In this case, the blue profile doesn't confer risk, so this subject has low risk, whereas the red profile does. And but the point is that they're not mutually exclusive. Each individual expresses all of them to a greater or lesser degree. We could, of course, just take these deviation scores as the basis for subsequent clustering, and that was something that Mariam did, one of my PhD students, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail. So this is the result I've already shown you, and this is in the EU AIMS cohort, which I know many of you will be familiar with already. So this is a classical case control analysis on cortical thickness, and we see some very minor effects, but nothing impressive. And these are, when we look at it in the context of a normative model, as I've shown you, we get very widespread deviations that are very idiosyncratic, and we get many more deviations in the autism cohort than we do in a typically developing cohort. So that gives us some confidence that what we are finding are disease-related effects. So Mariam took these images, applied a clustering algorithm, and these are the 5 clusters that she derived. This just shows you that they're fairly evenly distributed across the sites, because we don't want to just detect site effects. And more interestingly, they really explain, in my mind, why we don't see any group level differences. So we see there are 5, I wouldn't say, I've put them in inverted commas because I don't think we've gone far enough to claim that they're really biological subtypes yet. But 5 putative subtypes, let's say. 3 of them have decreased cortical thickness in autism, and 2 of them have increased cortical thickness in autism. So all of these things cancel out and effectively remove it. So it shows you very clearly why you don't see any group level differences. What she aimed to do then was to take this a little bit further in terms of validating these findings, and the way that she did that was check association with both symptoms across a number of different symptom domains, excuse me, in both autism and related disorders, ADHD, for example. What I'm showing you at the top is the association, the magnitude of correlation across the whole cohort for each of these different symptom domains. It's not important what they are. And then when we break them down into subtypes, we can see that there are associations with any subgroups of individuals. So the association always gets stronger, and we see more significant associations by breaking down the cohort into these biotypes. And the same is true with genetics. So we see weak associations at the cohort level, but stronger associations in one of the subtypes in this case. These are polygenic risk scores. Okay, so I'd like to come back to this idea about everything that I've shown you so far uses these kind of normative modeling techniques in cross-sectional data. I'd like to come back to using how we can use these in longitudinal data. As I've shown you already, in this regime, these techniques become extremely sensitive, and what we aim to do is detect a centile crossing. The way we do that is we have an estimate of the uncertainty with each in each of the centiles, and we use that to get a statistical measure as to whether there is the presence of a centile crossing or not. So these are the results that are. So we actually estimated that from the results in schizophrenia that I've already shown you before. These are estimated from real data. So if we have this as subjects age, the brain volume goes down. It goes down, slowly for all of us. And if we have a subject that might have an atypical trajectory, you can see what we want to do is we want to demonstrate statistically that the slope between time point 1 and time point 2 is different from what we would expect at the level of the normative model. And these centiles, the estimates of variation, the uncertainty in the centiles, as you can see, is quite low. And so within a period of 3 to 5 years, we can detect a quite subtle difference in the slope with respect to what we would see in the population. And this is the basis for, we're taking this further towards the, I don't have any results to show about this at the moment, but this is a Wellcome Trust funded project that we aim to detect early psychosis, so predicting the early trajectory of what happens in schizophrenia, and perhaps even predict the onset in at-risk cohorts. This is a collaboration together with Oslo and King's College London. And the idea is we take really large population-based data sets, UK Biobank, Human Connectome Project, etc., estimate a set of normative models on the basis of DTI-based measures, cortical thickness, and so on, derive these latent profiles, and ultimately we'll put this in the cloud so that individuals can upload, researchers can upload their MRI scans, get a set of predictions that they can then use profile for their own cohorts, for example. So for the last part of the talk, I would like to just sort of dig in a little bit to some of the, so I've given you kind of at a quite a high level some of the techniques that we've been working on and the clinical implications of those techniques. I'd like to sort of get a little bit deeper into the methodology for the last part of the talk. So there's a lot of challenges. I've glossed over the details of how we estimate these brain growth charts, but it basically comes down to fitting a probabilistic regression model, which, as you might imagine, if you have experience, for example, I'm sure Edward has a very good understanding of that these techniques are quite computationally demanding, particularly, and it is effectively not possible in very large cohorts. So one of my PhD students, Charlotte Fraser, has been developing methods that scale very elegantly to large cohorts, to UK Biobank data, and also allow us to model, for example, non-Gaussian distributions. And the way that is done is via an invertible warping function that enables us to map something that might have a particularly non-Gaussian shape. I'll show you an example to a Gaussian form and back again. Okay, so this is, I'll show you the example, an example that illustrates this principle. First of all, this is up to thousands of subjects. This is the classical approach, which are used in most of the applications I've shown you so far. That's based on Gaussian process regression. And you can see that this is effectively a fancy linear model, scales much better. I'll show you an example of how we can model, in this case, a normative model that charts population variation in white matter hyperintensity. So these are things that accumulate in the brain as we age, and they have a somewhat complex relationship to cognition. And they also have a very non-Gaussian shape. So these are here on the left hand, I'm showing you growth charts for males and females separately. But you can see that as, and this is data derived from UK Biobank, you can see that as people age, there's a very skewed distribution of how much of these hyperintensity different people accumulate, and using a Gaussian noise model doesn't model it adequately at all. Whereas you can see that using this warping model, we can get very precise estimates of centiles of variation in the population. And we can also use this technique to get estimates of using longitudinal data in UK Biobank when subjects are accelerating faster than what they would expect, what would be expected by the normative model. So I'm showing you in the bottom panel, I'm showing you there are 2 time points in UK Biobank at the moment, and all of the lines that you can see are the difference between time point 1 and time point 2, and I've colored in bold the subjects that are accelerating faster in a statistical sense than what would be predicted by the normative model. And it turns out that these subjects also have, the first thing is that it's, like many things, it's worse to be male. So you can see there's a lot more males have a worse progression than females. And also these have this has a stronger relationship with cognition. So by taking into account what we expect in the population on average, we can get a better prediction as to the future trajectory of what happens at the level of the individual. There's another challenge that's really important to address. We're pooling data sets across many different data sets. There are many quite strong side effects that we need to take into account, and many other sources of variation too. So if we don't take those into account here, I'm showing you data that's aggregated across multiple scanners. To get a good estimate of the lifespan, we need to integrate data from different sources. This is UK Biobank. You can see that there are really big estimates of variation across different sites, and to the effect that if we were to fit a normative model on the basis of these data, we're not going to get a good estimate. We're totally conflating site-related variation with the very kind of variation that we're interested in. The typical approach to dealing with that kind of problem is data harmonization. This is combat. This would be what most people in the field would do. The idea is that we take the data from different sites and we remove the site effect, so-called harmonization, that we could then use to make a prediction for in a sort of harmonized space. The idea is, I won't go into the details, but the idea is that we remove an additive and a multiplicative site effects and try to retain the signal of interest. I'll explain what that means in a moment. One of the key points I'd like to point out for now is that if you have data from a new site, so for example, that you haven't seen in the training set, then we need to recalculate all these parameters using the whole data set, which is quite cumbersome and not practical for the scale of data that we're working with. Combat does work. So you can see this is a large sample that we've been working with that pulls data across many different sites. This is I'm showing you before and after harmonization. You can see that it removes a lot of the site effects, and there's also a non-linear variant as well. One of the key points to note, though, is that because of the need, if we want to sample the whole lifespan, there's a need to pull data across different sites, and there are very strong correlations with age, which is something that we need to take into account. So the way that just to sort of dig, one of the problems that we see with this kind of harmonization approach is that in our hands, at least, it removes too much variance, and I'll explain why. So you can think of the problem of separating site variance from clinical variance in the following way. So we have different sources of variance. These in the data, these are these different circles in this figure. And for the purposes of this discussion, I'll divide it into three sources. So known variance, unknown variance, and batch effects. So known variants might be things like age or demographic characteristics, things that we model. Unknown effects are things that we might be interested in but didn't happen to measure. So for example, subtypes in psychiatric disorders. And the batch effects are the scanner-related artifacts that we want to remove. And of course, these things are correlated, as I've shown you already. So what combat does, if we just sort of break this equation down a little bit, the first thing it does is it removes the known variance. That's this part of the equation. Then it removes the batch effects. And then it puts back the known variance in the data. So this is retaining variances associated with the age of diagnosis. The problem is that combat can't remove this shared variance. So that's something that it has to deal with. And it removes this part of the unknown variance when it really shouldn't, because these are interesting clinical effects that we just didn't measure. So for exploratory data analysis, this approach, it's overly aggressive in our experience. So what Mosey, this is work from Mosey Kia, who's one of my postdocs, or he's now in Utrecht, but we still collaborate. He developed this kind of optimal model that actually doesn't remove variance from the data at all. So you can think about it like a Bayesian mixed effects model, hierarchical Bayesian regression that tries to find an optimal balance between stability and flexibility. So that is, on the one hand, complete pooling would be saying, okay, well, let's just ignore the site effects, assume that the data all come from a single site, which I've shown you already is unrealistic. And on the other hand, we don't pool the data at all. So we say, okay, well, we just treat each site independently. But then we can't make use of the fact that we've got these really rich data sets that come from different scanners. We can't get the benefit of big data. So this approach tries to find an optimal balance between these two, and it shares the parameters. What it does is it finds the optimal parameters that borrow strength from across different sites. I'll be happy to take some. I mean, I'm glossing over the details a bit, but that's in a nutshell what this approach does. He was also very interested because of these data sets that we're using are they're very large. So the UK Biobank, they have 40,000 subjects alone. So that's not something that you want to transfer, from one site to another. So what Mosey did is he framed this problem in what's called in machine learning a federated learning program, which means that we do the data analysis across different sites and we transfer parameters between them. So in the context of the Wellcome Trust project, for example, we're not allowed to share the clinical data because we don't have consent for that. So we do the analysis on the clinical data in situ, that is in the sites where they're acquired. And the idea is we develop the normative model. So this is using all the public data cohorts, 70,000 to 100,000 scans, which it's impossible to transfer those in a reasonable time. So we estimate the model here on the basis of these large data sets, and we transfer a set of parameters to the deployment centers. And then we can adapt the parameters to accommodate different side effects, for example, that we might not have seen in the training data. And then we make predictions that are well calibrated on the clinical data sets that we are primarily interested in. So this is a comparison of this method with respect to combat. I'm showing you here, this is the same data set I showed you before. Here, this is a comparison of the regression performance in terms of the correlation, the standardized mean squared error and the mean standardized log loss. So correlation higher is better, the other error methods lower is better. So we do better than the other methods in terms of all of these metrics. And then when we do this transfer step, which is that's where we take the big data cohorts and then apply them to the clinical cohorts, we can see that we do much better. So you can see that the correlation between either of these approaches is much higher. And this metric particularly, which is sensitive to also the magnitude of the variance, in this case, the naive approach is extremely poor. So the histogram is shifted off the side of the page here. It also deals with site effects properly. So here I'm showing you a confusion matrix, which shows you the accuracy with which a classifier can separate the sites. This is using the raw data. You can see that all of the sites are very distinct. We get nearly perfect accuracy across a multi-site, multi-class classification problem for separating the sites. And then after applying this approach, taking the Z statistic, the deviation scores basically, you can see that the accuracy is just about reduced to charge. Not quite. There's still some residual side effects in the data, but it's much better than not doing anything at all. Across a number of different disorders, so we have some of these samples. We have different disorders: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, etc., Alzheimer's disease. And what Mosey did was he trained a classifier on to discriminate these disorders in an unsupervised way. So that is, we just aim to do anomaly detection. That is, we say, well, is this subject different from what we've seen before? So the classifier's never seen a patient, and you can see that we get pretty respectable accuracies for most of these disorders. So this is in a totally unsupervised framework. The last piece of work that I'll talk to you about is a deep learning based approach that aims to learn optimal representations for predicting behavior. So I'm sure, unless you've been living in a cave, you will have heard of deep learning. The totally transformed the landscape in machine learning the last 5 years. And the idea is that we take some kind of structured input. So this, for example, an image, pass it through not lots of nonlinear transformations to predict, for example, a class label. Okay. These have been applied in many contexts in neuroimaging, and I would say that the accuracy, the evidence that they improve performance is quite typical, I would say. So this example is a model that aims to predict brain age. That is what's the age that we can of someone's brain, roughly speaking. And this is a 3D convolutional approach. The details are not important, but it's a reasonable deep learning approach, but it doesn't perform better than a linear model. This is one example where this kind of deep learning approach does work better than a normative model. This was an approach by Han Peng and colleagues, a so-called lightweight neural network that used a number of techniques, for example, transferred information from UK Biobank to really make use of these big data cohorts, and did get a small advantage over linear models and won the 2019 Brain Age Challenge. But the point is that I think these representations that these deep learning models are highly tuned, the representations that they learn are highly tuned for predicting a particular problem, in this case, predicting age, which is all well and good if that's what you're interested in, but it's not a general purpose technique. So what Mariam aimed to do, so this is the last paper from Mariam's PhD, and we aim to learn somewhat of a more generalized representation. And the tool that we use for this particular problem is what's known as an autoencoder, and that's a network that aims to learn a latent representation of the data. It's like squeezes the data through a bottleneck and then reconstructs the data again. We applied this technique to task-related fMRI data from the Human Connect project for a more universal latent representation of brain function. Why would we use the Human Connectome project data? Because it has a number of different fMRI tasks that provide good coverage of the brain on the one hand, but also many different cognitive functions. So it can learn lots of these subtle representations that might be useful for predicting multiple tasks, for example. For the methods people, this is she did a pilot study where she, in a properly held out manner using a validation set, evaluated different architectures. And this was the architecture that she derived in the end. And the idea is that we take this middle layer, this is the bottleneck layer, and we can then train some kind of manifold learning technique, some kind of representation to get an idea of what this thing is representing. So the first set of results I'll show you is if we were to try to separate these different tasks, the autoencoder learns a cleaner separation of the different tasks. So this is, for example, separating language tasks from working memory tasks. If we just do PCA, which is like a linear equivalent, we don't get very good separation. There's lots of overlap, but applying this technique, we get very clear distinctions between the different tasks, and also very clear distinctions between different contrasts within the same task. So it seems to be, on the face of it, quite a useful representation, but that, of course, is not really what we're interested in. What I think is more important is, can we use this thing to predict behavior? And in the Human Connectome project, we have a lot of different behavioral scores that measure different kinds of cognition, reward processing, self-esteem, emotional processing, and so on. What I'm showing you here is the accuracy, the average accuracy across all of these different measures that we can predict these different tasks. So you can see that in this case, this is the blue line is the autoencoder, and the red line is the linear model. And you can see that in all of these different tasks, except for this one, we can get a much higher average accuracy. So in other words, more accurate predictions of behavior from the representation that this network learns. We can transfer that to different data sets. So we applied this to UK Biobank, learning the model on Human Connectome project, transferring it to the UK Biobank, adjusting the parameters a little bit, and again we stronger behavioral associations using this model than we did with the linear. Where are we taking that? So there's a number of different approaches. We could use this for kind of novelty detection. So this is the approach that I mentioned earlier about learning to separate different conditions without using the class labels, normative modeling, and so on and so forth. So just to wrap things up, I've shown you some of this talk has been, how can learn about heterogeneity within disorders. I think I hope to convince you that, thinking about subtyping using classical clustering algorithms is really only the beginning. There's much more going on and underlying these group effects than just finding subtypes. I've shown you methods about on the basis of normative modeling, how we can use population level cohorts to learn about variation in population level cohorts and use that to make predictions at the level of the individual participant. And I've also shown you some methodological techniques, and I think that and be able to get at some of these effects. I just want the many people who actually did the work, my funding bodies. I would also like to just say that all of the tools that we've developed that I've talked about are online. They're freely available. We'll be looking to take on new people to work with us. If you're interested, please feel free to make contact with me afterwards. And I'd just like to thank you all very much for your attention.